Welcome back to An Anthropologist and a Cat discuss Judith Butler. We are in Gender Trouble, Chapter 2, and in this video we're covering sections 3 through 5. So section 3 is Freud and the Melancholia of Gender. And easily the first half of this section is an explanation of discussing what this melancholia is, which, comes from his essay, Mourning and Melancholia. In the experience of losing another human being whom one has loved, Freud argues the ego is said to incorporate the other into the very structure of the ego, taking on attributes of the other and sustaining the other through magical acts of imitation. So, and goes on, in cases which an ambivalent, still can't talk, relationship is severed through loss, that ambivalence becomes internalized as a self-critical or self-debasing disposition in which the role of the other is now occupied and directed by the ego itself. The process of internalizing and sustaining lost loves is crucial to the formation of the ego and its object choice. So, and Freud later suggests that the internalizing strategy of melancholia does not oppose the work of mourning, but may be the only way in which the ego can survive the loss of its essential emotional ties to others. As someone who internalizes a lot, meaning every single one of my feelings, this is definitely a, not really a critical, really need to stop doing that, coping mechanism that people use on a semi-regular basis to deal with things. So, and Freud goes on, discussing, how a boy must either identify with the mother or the father, thereby rejecting whichever one they don't identify with. And Freud means to suggest that the boy must choose not only between the two object choices, but the two sexual dispositions, masculine and feminine. That the boy usually chooses the heterosexual would, then, be the result not of the fear of castration by the father, but the fear of castration, that is, the fear of feminization, associated within heterosexual cultures with male homosexuality. You see this in, a lot of things. Because men are taught not to have feelings or show those feelings because that is a feminine attribute. We could have a whole nother video discussing why this is bad, but the repudiation of the mother becomes the founding moment of what Freud calls gender consolidation. Forfeiting the mother as object of desire, the boy either internalizes the loss through identification with her, or displaces his heterosexual attachment, in which case he fortifies his attachment to his father, and thereby consolidates his masculinity. This could provide I don't want to say really good explanation for why men always want to find a woman just like their mother. But he goes on to discussing, how this affects a young girl as well. The loss of the father initiated by the incest taboo may result either in the identification with the object lost, a consolidation of masculinity, or a deflection of the aim from the object, in which case heterosexuality triumphs over homosexuality and a substitute object is found. Freud remarks that the factor that decides which identification is accomplished is the strength or weakness of masculinity and femininity in her disposition. Okay? So, and we go on a few pages later to a further discussion of the Oedipus complex. But clearly not all gender identification is based on the successful implementation of the taboo against homosexuality. Because gender identity appears primarily to be the internalization of a prohibition that proves to be formative of identity. Further, this identity is constructed and maintained by the consistent application of the taboo, not only in the stylization of the body in compliance with discrete categories of sex, but in the production and disposition of sexual desire. The melancholia of gender identification, which answers the Oedipal dilemma, must be understood then as the internalization of an interior moral directive which gains its structure and energy from an externally enforced taboo. So, you're basically working within these prohibitions because these feelings are repressed and all this other stuff. In The History of Sexuality, Foucault criticizes the repressive hypothesis for the presumption of an original desire, not desire in Lacan's terms, but jouissance, that maintains ontological integrity and temporal priority with respect to the repressive law. This law, according to Foucault, subsequently silences or transmutes that desire into a secondary and inevitably dissatisfying form or expression. So, you've got this taboo against incest, and implicitly against homosexuality is a repressive injunction which presumes an original desire localized in the notion of dispositions which suffer a repression of an originally homosexual libidinal directionality and produces the displaced phenomenon of heterosexual desire. Basically, Freud's talking about how everyone is repressed and you're either, attached to your mother or your father, and that attachment, for whatever reason, influences whether or not you end up straight or not. Freud is weird. That's all I'm... So, we're moving on to section 4, gender complexity and the limits of identification. Multiple identifications can constitute a non-hierarchical configuration of shifting and overlapping identifications that call into question the primacy of any univocal gender attribution, which Butler briefly throws back to the Lacan that we discussed earlier in this chapter, last video, for those of you who haven't seen it. In the Lacanian framework, identification is understood to be fixed within the binary disjunction of having or being the phallus. So, and on the next page, Butler, talks about how feminist critics find this the psychoanalytic definition problematic, which, let's be honest, it is, because you've talking about this maternal identification and how the discourse evolved from the point of view of that identification and its difficulties. And it tends to reinforce precisely the binary heterosexist framework that carves up genders into masculine and feminine and forecloses an adequate description of the kinds of subversive and parodic convergences that characterize gay and lesbian cultures. The binary is bad. So, you're looking at these, the subversion, and we come further. When we consider gender identity as a melancholic structure, it makes sense to choose incorporation as the manner by which that identification is accomplished. Gender identity would be established through a refusal of loss that encrypts itself in the body and that determines, in effect, the living versus the dead body. Then we come back to visit my favorite friend, the incest taboo. If gender differentiation follows upon the incest taboo and the prior taboo on homosexuality, then becoming a gender is a laborious process of becoming naturalized, italics, which requires a differentiation of bodily pleasures and parts on the basis of gendered meanings. So, everything is, gendered meanings. Everything we do is gendered. Like, I wear tight-ish jeans because, or better example, I wear yoga pants. 1, because they're comfortable, and 2, and you don't see guys generally wearing yoga pants because it's considered feminine. Also because, dudes don't find them as comfortable as other people do. So moving into section 5, reformulating prohibition as power. Feminist theorists have been drawn. It's dreary outside, it's making me tired. Have been drawn to the psychoanalytic account of sexual difference, in part because the Oedipal and pre-Oedipal dynamics appear to offer a way to trace the primary construction of gender. So, basically, we follow the incest taboo because using pre-Oedipal and Oedipal, it helps us trace the primary constructions of gender. And then Foucault argues on behalf of reproductive law without the postulation of an original desire. Lost my place. The operation of this law is justified and consolidated through the construction of a narrative account of its own genealogy, which effectively masks its own immersion in power relations. Everything is power relations. Everything. And Gail Rubin gets quoted in this section that before the transformation of a biological male or female into gendered man or woman, quote, each child contains all of the sexual possibilities available to human expression, end quote. So, pretty much until we get super gendered, which, let's be honest, starts at like birth, we contain all possibilities of sexual expression, which is pretty neat, even if it makes sense, even though we're socialized into gender, again, from birth. You also run into, as you grow, you develop your own gender identity. And, it's a fluid concept, so you're just kind of floating along. And once you realize that, you're like, okay, maybe I like dudes. Maybe I like chicks. Maybe I like non-binary people. It's all very, I don't want to say subjective, but it's all very individual. And although, this is where it gets interesting, although Rubin claims that the unlimited universe of sexual possibilities exists for the pre-Oedipal child, she does not subscribe to a primary bisexuality. So, bisexuality is the consequent of child-rearing practices in which parents of both sexes are present and presently occupied with childcare, in which the repudiation of femininity no longer serves as a precondition of gender identity for both men and women. That explains so much. It really does. Going down a little further, inasmuch as gender is the cultural transformation of biological polysexuality into a culturally mandated heterosexuality, and inasmuch as that heterosexuality deploys discrete and hierarchized gender identities to accomplish its aim, then the breakdown of the compulsory character of heterosexuality would imply, for Rubin, the corollary breakdown of gender itself. Rubin's argument rests on the possibility that the law can be effectively overthrown and that cultural interpretations of differently sexed bodies can proceed, ideally without reference to gender disparity. And then, so you've got this repressive hypothesis, and people have a lot of different feelings about it, especially within psychoanalysis. Because Foucault then has a critique of the repressive hypothesis, and you've got how the incest taboo forbids and dictates sexuality in certain forms, and then inadvertently produces substitute desires, which are not constrained in advance, which is good. Constriction is bad. And within psychoanalysis, bisexuality and homosexuality are taken to be primary libidinal dispositions, and heterosexuality is the laborious construction based upon their gradual repression, while basically we all start out bi or otherwise, which is really interesting. Thank you, Freud, you did something useful. Aside from, people all want to screw their mothers. Alright, so that finishes up chapter 2. And in the next video, we're going to get to one of my favorite chapters of this book, which is subversive bodily acts. And so, with that, I'll see you next time. Bye!